Debt is a term that has been quite notorious recently. It has been politicized many times throughout one's country. Its positive impacts have been shunned, and people have only looked to the fallacies and negative impacts it brings. After all, debt has caused many financial collapses, and some Western nations have even downplayed the use of it due to a term called debt trap. In the Philippines, these are seen throughout. It has accumulated loads of debt. It has been noted to be a headache throughout history. However, while that may be true, we should not shy away from the fact that debt is an instrument when used properly will promote economic growth and not the other way around. The Philippines, on the other hand, is intertwined in both scenarios. Debt has been improperly used, but also cited as one of the country's economic drivers. Amongst the forms of debt the country has leveraged over time was external debt, one of the most notorious debt instruments. However, being so unfavored, it has still constructed many infrastructures and crafted many programs. But the question still lies for the country: was it the best choice? Will using debt to construct infrastructures bear fruit? Well, to understand where the misconception of debt lies, we must first go back to the history of the Philippines. The Philippines has a long history of using external debt, but what caused the country's demise was during the 1970s. In 1975, the government had amassed an external debt of over $4.1 billion. This figure was pretty high, as the country only had a GDP of around $16 billion, which shows that its external debt is around a quarter of its GDP. But the problem is yet to be seen. Its external debt would double to $8.2 billion in 2 years. However, its GDP would not grow as much and only be about $22 billion. This would have suggested that the country has at least 35% of external debt to GDP, which is a figure that does not even include its domestic debt. These debts, however, were used to fuel economic growth, build infrastructures, and so on. However, some of these plans were not entirely great. Some of them have ended up being too expensive. Further, some of them would even fall into the hands of a small group of people led by the country's political instability. Therefore, its notorious use was not only due to its mismanagement, but also to corruption. This, however, was not the end of the story. The country's external debt would rise from around 35% of GDP to over 60% by 1990, only to rise to a high of over 70% by 2003. Foreign debt has then been aligned with problems rather than economic benefits. These external debts have indeed harmed the country and its government revenues, since they were using some of the money they generated to repay the debts they had gotten over those decades. This is not to shun that all of the external debt of the Philippines was completely bad. It still has a lot to say in the economy of the Philippines: bridges, railways, roads, schools, medical centers, and the long list goes on. The fear of foreign debt should then be pointed out to its connection with mismanagement and political corruption. However, while these have indeed plagued the country's economic growth in the past, is it still true in today's landscape? Have we still not learned from the decade-long fallacies? Well, let us take a close look at what the data says. According to the latest data published by the Central Bank of the Philippines, the government right now only has around $109 billion worth of external debt, which is roughly 27% of the country's GDP. Remember, it was 70% back in 2003. Therefore, it should already tell us that the days when the external debt was weighing down the economy of the Philippines are now gone. Yet, the fear is still embedded in the country and is continuously being politicized. So how did the government fix its external debt problem? Simple. The country grew. The country grew far faster than how much it could borrow. Its overall external debt increased from $75 billion in 2011 to over $109 billion by the latest data in 2022, but its GDP grew faster. Was it due to the infrastructures built in the 1970s to the 21st century? It could be part of the story, but we should understand that the Philippines has a very low external debt to GDP today. However, this external debt is not even the entire story yet. There is no clear data on what the specific details there are about the external debt in the 1970s or around the start of the 21st century. But today, we can see it due to the transparency the central bank has given its society. The entire $109 billion external debt of the Philippines is far lower than most people think. $109 billion is composed of both the public and private sectors. This means that the figure is shared by what these private corporations borrow and what the government borrows. This data is not presented as far as we know back in those decades. But anyway, among the $109 billion, only $67 billion belong to the government, which indicates that the Philippines has a far lower external debt than is held by its government. The remaining $42 billion belong to the private sector. If we take a closer look at these data, the $67 billion the government holds are held from two categories. The first is from multilateral institutions, meaning the likes of the Asian Development Bank, the International Monetary Finance, and so on. These multilateral have collectively loaned $28.7 billion to the Philippines, where the most came from the Asian Development Bank. From a bilateral standpoint, meaning country to country, the largest creditor to the Philippines is Japan, which has an estimated lending amount to be around $14.8 billion. To debunk most myths, China only has $22 billion. The remaining are from government-issued bonds. Most of these debts are not borrowed the same way by the government as it is from the private corporations of the Philippines. The private sector is divided into two categories: banking and non-banking. Banks mostly get their external debts to increase due to international deposits, meaning some foreign entities or individuals may have a local bank in the Philippines. If they deposit in them, it will reflect in the balance sheet. This is applied to the banking sector, but these banks sometimes also hold some form of loan. For the non-banking sector, which actually contains most of the external debt at $27 billion out of the $42 billion, they are mostly to finance their business's growth. Often enough, where these private corporations get money comes from Singapore. Many Southeast Asian companies do the same. Why do these private corporations in the Philippines borrow money from Singapore or Japan? Because of their position in the financial world. This borrowed money can be directly from banks through loans, or it could also be the same way as its government through selling bonds. But in the case of private businesses, it is known as corporate bonds. Bonds are a good source of funding for governments and private companies. Also, one of the reasons why these corporations or governments go to other countries for raising money is because they either have more money or they provide extra expertise. This is because the Philippines does not have an endless amount of money for its private and government to borrow from, especially when we talk about billions of dollars. Hence, they turn to international markets. This is not to say that debt is still a prominent instrumental economic driver, and we should not deviate from the truth that the Philippines holds the external debt. However, in today's landscape, external debt is now negligent and has actually been providing numerous economic benefits. Debts, as we noted earlier, are a form of leverage used to fund growth, whether by corporations or by countries. The only issue is if it is mismanaged. However, it does not seem to be the case from the Philippines' point of view. As the entire external debt has gone down significantly, why would we suggest that it is being properly managed? It is because most of the programs and initiatives started today are transparent. We can see the very roads and bridges around the country. Back then, transparency was negligent, if not very difficult to see. Furthermore, external debt is not at risk levels. From 2018 to 2021, it only went from $78 billion to $109 billion, whereas the country's GDP went from $346 billion to $394 billion. Likewise, the country's gross international reserves have also gone up, from $79 billion in 2018 to over $108 billion by 2021. These figures will need another story, but for now we will leave it at that. Anyway, this is just one part of the story, of course, and it could be viewed from numerous sides. Do let us know what you think.